Welcome again to day 8. After the lecture and the other assignments today, we will be officially halfway through this course. So let's jump in. We've got a lot to cover today in discussing the Reformation and the Renaissance. We're going to start with the Renaissance. We're going to talk about science, and we're going to talk about religion. We're going to fill in some of the details that Gaarder left out in his little history here, but not too much. Also to point out some important themes that also were not present in his work. So let's start here. Here we have the more or less, this isn't quite right, but it is based on the same basic principle, the Ptolemaic geocentric model of the solar system. It's a mouthful. So Ptolemy was an incredible astronomer, and the geocentric model was, as you know, for the longest time, the dominant model of our solar system. Of course, geocentric meaning literally the Earth is in the center. And if you look here in this image, you can see this text written in Latin, a schema or schematic diagram that basically says previously mentioned spheres. So based on the previously mentioned spheres, or depicting the previously mentioned spheres being divided, the divided spheres. So we see these, that's an important word here, by the way, the spheres, not orbits. We tend to get this wrong. More on that in a bit. But the center of the universe, as it were, not just the solar system, is the Earth, of course, God's most, you could say, focus of creation. And then following that, you can see Luna, the moon, and Mercury, the Mercury, of course. Then we have Venus, the sun, which is would have seemed to be sandwiched between Venus, and then the next one, Martis, is Mars, of course. Iois is in fact Jupiter, and then Saturni for Saturn. As you can possibly make out here, Neptune, Uranus, a couple of others weren't even in our awareness at this time in history. We needed telescopes and such to see that, which of course will be invented soon. Hurrah, in this period of history. It's pretty great. Now, the important thing to point out here is this is based on a long tradition that we mentioned last time during medieval history, which was the movement of scholasticism. And scholasticism, as you can see here, in trying to harmonize Christianity with ancient philosophy, was primarily over time based and focused on specifically the works of Aristotle. Now, as much as I am more an Aristotelian versus a Platoist, I have to say that the Aristotelian model for the universe, however great his philosophy is, his model for understanding the planets and so forth, while really not bad for his time, is completely inadequate with new discoveries that are being made, not just obviously today, but as early back as 1200s and previous. So the problem becomes compounded over time when you're trying to depict a world that you only have so much data of and so many ways to experiment with. This is the sort of result you get. Now, to be completely honest, the work of Ptolemy is really great. It's an incredible work. It helps us predict what we ultimately want, which is behaviors of the planets. And if you think about what the purpose of science is, in a sense, it's not so much to get things right as to, that is, get the things in themselves right, as it is to get predictions right. And we have to draw this very careful distinction. If the map is never truly the territory, then all scientific models are always going to fall short of being exact depictions of the world as it is without us thinking about it or without our scientific investigations. More on that later, perhaps. But take a look at this. These are the epicycles, as they're called, which was a perfectly legit explanation for the way the heavenly bodies work. So in the center, the blue dot there is, of course, our blue Earth, and then the sun is revolving around that in a way that would seem to instead resemble a planet rather than a star in the ways that we think of them today. And then out beyond that, you can see Mars. And Mars appears to be cycling around in what we call a cardioid, this sort of almost circle, not really a circle. And these epicycles, or epicycles as they're called, were the ways of explaining the behavior of those heavenly bodies in the sky. See, it's not that people weren't taking account of data of what was going on completely. You actually had this almost double standard. On the one hand, some people wanted to take Aristotle completely for granted. His ideas of gravity, his ideas of the heavenly bodies, his ideas on biology. And of course, that included a very poor reflection on women within the human species. But then you also have these people who are continuing to look and observe and take in data and try and create closer to accurate models to make better predictions. Where is Mars going to be a week from now, a year from now, etc.? So Ptolemy does a really terrific job, and while this looks like nonsense to us today, you have to remember that we're always having to reform our ideas of how the world and nature work. So why did this change then, you might ask? There are a number of things that aren't quite working about this model. It's not simply the fact that now you have to explain epicycles, and those epicycles are actually, while they're mathematically beautiful, they're not very easy to explain in terms of sheer physics, even though the predictions are working quite well. It still doesn't really seem to account for all possible predictions, all different forms of data. And on top of that, this is actually sort of a lie, this graphic, because it seems to depict that people thought at the time that planets worked within orbits. That is, that they worked on this sort of line or curved line around other bodies. And that's not exactly it. Remember how we depicted a moment ago the graphic of the spheres? It said spheres, not orbits. So, fast forward to just Copernicus' time, right? So Nicolaus Copernicus comes about, and here's the thing. It's not that he looks at Ptolemy's work and goes, oh, this is all trash. Let me reform this. Oppositely, he actually feels that Ptolemy is, he adores him. He's following Ptolemy's model to a T, with this one tiny little exception. He says there seems, though, to be also a way of simplifying some of this by, instead of making the Earth the center of this solar system, of this model, I should say, because it was still the center of the universe, as it were. What if the sun were the center and the Earth were revolving around it? That does away with a lot of all this epicycle talk and all these other things. It would seem to simplify things. So here we see a more heliocentric model of the solar system. That is a sun-centered model. However, this is still an inaccurate depiction. So Copernicus got it right. Not quite. Copernicus is still bent on trying to explain the behaviors that still, to some extent, might have included some epicycles, might not have included epicycles. He's still trying to work this out, and he's still thinking of these orbits, as we call them today. He's still thinking of these in terms of spheres, not curved lines and so forth. What do I mean by a sphere? I mean, imagine, of course, like this shell around which the planets could move, right? So it's kind of like the Earth. If you were to walk around the Earth, you could just take a straight line, go straight forever, and you'd end up back in your original spot if you did it correctly, if you did it well. But you could also take a left here or a right here. You could move around, as it were. You could go around, you could start in this spot, and depending on just what your degrees were, you could end up spiraling around the Earth before you eventually got back to your original point. So there is no necessary, immediately obvious reason, I should say, for us to think that the planets move around the sun nor that they move around the sun in a curved line as opposed to a sort of shell or sphere. So these are all ideas that we take for granted today, but there was no reason up to this point. It wasn't that people were dumb. It was that when you think about it, there's something very counterintuitive that only recently has started to feel intuitive given the culture and nature of science that's available to us today. By the way, we also seem to get a sense that somehow only in the Renaissance and recent times were some of these ideas first entertained. The idea of a heliocentric model dates back long before, in fact. Fun little film that would be worth watching. One of my favorite films, in fact, of all time, is about the philosopher named Hypatia. And Hypatia is this incredible mathematician. She doesn't give birth too much to new ideas, but she starts to work out for herself why the idea of a heliocentric model might make sense. And she first starts to think about, as it were, the idea of orbits and stuff as maybe elliptoids as opposed to shells, like spherical shells and so forth. So it's a very interesting film, and it gets into her as the philosopher versus this clash between fundamentalist Christianity and the Romans in Alexandria during this really important point in history when the library of Alexandria is burned down and all. It's incredible. So go check out the film if you get a chance. I love it. It has Rachel Weisz as Hypatia, by the way. She's great. So scholasticism is finally being somewhat overthrown here because for the first time in a long time, and what really seems to help in delineating between this time period before, when you had the medieval philosophers, and this time period after, when the Renaissance really takes off, Aristotle is no longer going to be so vehemently relied on. We are overturning Aristotle here, as it were, at least when it comes to physics and scientific investigations. We have to turn over the idea of gravity and the idea of maybe even the size of the universe, and you can see these ideas being entertained some by Gaarder, specifically Alberto in the story. Here's a quick example of that Aristotelian ideology being questioned. Aristotle, as you may have heard or learned before, believed that all objects don't necessarily obviously fall to the ground at the same time, and we've observed that before. If I take two things, this eraser and this chapstick, and I drop them, they hit the floor at the same time. Now, Aristotle would have said, yes, that's because they were of equal weight, or perhaps mass. Mass wasn't really a concept yet, so let's just call it weight. Now, what though if I took this eraser and, say, this flower here? Well, they drop at the same time. The eraser hit the ground just a tad sooner than the flower. So if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that this flower is, in fact, quite a bit less in weight than this eraser. So it would make perfect sense to think that the weight determines gravity. Now, this is, again, assuming that the things themselves determine gravity. We have no reason to go against that notion until you start doing some further experimentation, as Galileo does. So many hundreds of years later, 1,000 years later, he's trying this again, and he's trying to think, and he takes a very simple thought experiment, and this is genius. This simple thought experiment helps with recharacterizing the way we would think of gravity. So take two objects. Let's say I take, I'm going to take a stone now, and I take the eraser, all right? And let's say, hypothetically, that I tie a string between them so that they're now combined. Now, keep in mind, if gravity is going to take the heavier object and make it fall faster, then we would assume that there would be, and assuming there's not an outside influence for gravity, that is, gravity is determined by the weight itself of these objects, then we're going to run into a contradiction here. Remember how important contradictions are? They're good in science too. This thought experiment helps discern for Galileo what is wrong, or at least that something is wrong in the way Aristotle has characterized this. So if these two things are tied at the waist, so to speak, and I drop them at the same time, what would we expect to happen if Aristotle is right? Well, we've got a problem here. So on the one hand, if Aristotle is right, we would expect that this stone is going to be falling faster. But keep in mind, it's dragging behind it now, because they're tied together, the lighter object. Okay, well, does that mean it just makes the lighter object drop faster? But if the individual things are going to have a designated weight, and this is going to be lighter, if anything, the eraser would seem to be pulling back on this one. So this whole thing ought to be dropping actually less quickly. It should be falling less quickly to the ground, if only because the eraser in its own right is going to be falling less quickly. So what do I mean by this? I mean, imagine that you had two cars too. If you had a car going one speed and the other car going at a slower speed, if they're not connected, it doesn't make a difference to either car. But if you were to tie those two cars together, then what would you expect to see happen? Well, maybe the car in back is being pulled a little bit faster. If cars are not good for you, cars may not work. Imagine then like little motorboats being tied together on the water. That is maybe an even better one. Then the car or the boat in the back will be pulled a little bit faster, right? You would expect that. But then the other one would be pulled a little bit slower, right? You would expect that because the other one is binding it back, is holding it back, as it were. So the combined object here, which really is just, it could be thought of as one thing, it's just these two tied together, would actually be falling at a slower rate than if this rock were on its own and the eraser were allowed to drop individually too. But this is a contradiction because on the one hand, we also have a combined object. It's still an object. It should, if anything, be falling faster if Aristotle is right, not slower. So clearly, a contradiction has been made in the way that we've thought of gravity. And Galileo manages to do this with a simple thought experiment. That you have experiments as they are empirically conducted on things in nature, but you also have thought experiments that continue to revolutionize the way that we think about things, following which often actual experimentation will either confirm or disconfirm. Einstein is another excellent example. He imagined riding on a light beam long before, and therefore how gravity can affect light, long before people actually confirmed it by looking through the telescope and seeing light bend around the sun. Now, Galileo was, of course, willing to put his money where his mouth was. My understanding is that he was, in fact, willing to show off to his friends when they were traveling in a boat together. He took his ideas of gravity and specifically inertia and helped his friends see the truth by asking while they're riding on this boat that they hand to him some special item, a pair of glasses or really expensive whatever, something valuable. And Galileo would, of course, remind them that the current conception is that things are not considered relative but absolute to one another. What does this mean? So that means that if things in this prior model, if Galileo were to throw something up from the boat, imagine that boat, I'll use my rock here, imagine that boat traveling, if Galileo threw something up into the air, then as the boat continued to move, that thing would fall into the water behind them. That would make total sense, and that's actually the most intuitive explanation for what happens in the world. But it's not what really happens. Galileo was willing to bet on that. So as the boat would move, he'd throw it straight up in the air, and of course it would come back down into his hand on the boat. His terrified friends, absolutely confounded as well by what happened, would nonetheless be shaken because of this new information where thinkers are not entertained alone by an idea or a thought, but they're willing to put it into practice and to experiment empirically. So that's that's what Gaarder touches on about the empirical method is really just one of two sides of a greater movement here that is continuing up to the present day. And of course, as we all know, Galileo, despite revoking so many of his ideas at a moment's notice, due only to the threat from above by Christian authorities, that he changed his views of the world, the solar system, and so forth in order to, again, conform to Christian views. That, nonetheless, we continue to see time and time again confirmations of the experiments of these great thinkers, where we can finally identify the actual cause of gravity not to be in the individual objects themselves, but into the relation between objects, such that the only thing that's really holding the flower back, we realize, is another force, that is friction through air, so air resistance. And were we to go to the moon, as we have, and experiment there, we'd find that they would hit the ground at the same time.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand, a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? Which proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
There are two really fundamental things we have to talk about. One is this idea of a law. And I don't mean, of course, laws that govern society, and yet I kind of do. When we talk about the laws of nature, this was not always conceived this way. We use it today without thinking about what it really means. What does it mean to be a law of nature? Well, we might think of it as, well, it's like a mathematical depiction or a principle by which nature or physics has to function in the universe. Has to. There's a lot of interesting language in this. Why law? Why isn't it called a principle? Why is it a law? Have you ever wondered that before? Why do we call them laws of nature? And up to this point, before we talk about them in science, the only time we ever use the word law is when we're talking about what people are expected to do or not do. And if you go against that, it's illegal. So there's something odd here and at work, in my opinion. Think about the fact that a law of society is not unbreakable. It's that if you broke it, you would be either punished or you'd be looked down upon. You're expected not to break it for the sake of society. Meanwhile, we talk about the law of physics as things that literally cannot be broken. Principles or rules that cannot be broken. There's this conception of physics or nature was not always present either. And it's only past few hundred years, really, that we've been referring to such hardcore boundary, we can call them boundary conditions or limitations to what nature supposedly can and can't do, or what physical matter can and can't do in the universe. And describing them as laws of nature is a very interesting thing, because does that also bring with it not just the idea that there are boundaries, but that those boundaries could occasionally be broken? If so, what happens if you break the laws of nature? And so that may seem like a silly question. Well, the whole point is you can't break the laws of nature, but isn't every scientific revolution seemingly pushing the envelope on what can or can't be broken? I think there are some, however, definite boundary conditions that seem most apparent today that it's very hard to conceive of changing, such as the law of conservation, which Galileo in particular will be contributing massively to in this time period. If there's no other law that makes sense to hold on to and cling to as the most likely boundary condition for our universe, the law of conservation seems to me a great candidate for us to continue with into the future for that boundary, for that limit. So of course, conservation is just another way of saying, you've heard probably the conservation of energy, that nothing can create nor destroy energy when you consider at large the whole system. That means, again, that if energy is neither created nor destroyed, then it always is just transforming into different, forms throughout that system. Of course, then, if we look at a bounded system, some subset of the system, then energy would appear to be created and destroyed all the time. So, again, law of nature being what it is, it seems to not only be trying to set what boundary conditions there are for nature, that is physical reality, to operate by, but it also would seem to require us to consider the farthest extent boundary conditions for the system in consideration. This is going to pose a real problem for us, and you can see also for the Renaissance people, around what it means to live in an infinite universe. Does that mean that we're talking about a set or system that is infinitely large, around which we can't set boundary conditions? How do we limit the scope of something that's infinite? So it's not as straightforward as it may seem, this idea of a law of nature. There's so much to take into consideration when you even call something a law of nature, and then you still have to wonder, a law of nature pertaining to what scope? There's another really important movement or trend that's going on during this time, and Gaarder touches on it, and I want to re-emphasize it. All right, it's essentially individualism versus collectivism is one way we can think about it. The distinction here is extremely important for understanding what sort of transition we've made as a human species, how societies have evolved over time and civilization tends to trend, it would seem, toward. So individualism, as this perhaps particularly Renaissance or Enlightenment concept, is the idea that the individual, him or herself, is fundamentally important, valuable, worthy. Worthy of what? Worthy of educating, worthy of taking seriously, capable also, potentially capable, as it were, of becoming a genius, the Renaissance man, as it were. There were also, as you can imagine, Renaissance women, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, whom we won't speak much about today either, but I'm not going to get into particular philosophers at this moment so much as the scientific thinkers. Individualism, then. So this is to be opposed or juxtaposed to collectivism. There are still many societies, both in the past and recently, that still operate on a more collectivist principle, which is that individuals are great and all, but really it's for the sake of the collective that we do anything at all, that we operate. Take these things that we now consider, the great wonders of the world, the pyramids, for instance, or the Great Wall of China. Now, if we had an individualist mentality around that, maybe one person would have designed and gotten appreciated for that, and then many people would have been perhaps voluntarily helping bring that achievement about, as what happened with massive churches, incredible churches, cathedrals that were built. But that's not what often happened. The Great Wall of China, pyramids, they were often either due to enslavement or to sheer mandatory participation. People were brought in, even to the point that they were worn down to the bone and died because of it, brought in to create these massive structures. We haven't always appreciated the individual life as much as we have today. And we have a lot to thank to this period, particularly in Europe and Western philosophy and these thinkers, for bringing this about. Northern Italy really gave something incredibly, an incredible gift, we could say, to people. We can go overboard in this too. We've seen people go to such an extent they become almost solipsistic, meaning they get so involved with their individual self that the world would seem to need to conform to what they would like of it. But regardless, those faults aside, it's a great thing, in my opinion, to consider the individual life. And perhaps this doesn't need only apply to human beings. Perhaps we can also then start to see an individualist perspective on not just human beings, animals, plants, individual rocks and trees, and not even just elements of nature, but things in general. Again, more on that another time. And along with that, we can see the effects not only in science, but in religion. So Martin Luther did probably more for us than we will ever know in terms, culturally speaking, of freedom and freedom specifically of authority. So during this individualist trending era, here comes along one man who has followed the recipe for Christianity to a T, and he's followed it line by line, and yet over time he starts to develop this deep skepticism toward the necessity of so many of these practices and the so-called authority of the Catholic bishops and the Pope and so forth. Do these individuals really have this ability, this capability of direct understanding of the lessons and moral imperatives that the Bible shares with us? Right? So Christianity, following scholasticism, is again going to change massively due to this movement. Luther essentially answers his own question with no, they don't. In fact, the individual, to become a truly good Christian or to become a truly good human being, which to them was synonymous, you would have to investigate the Bible yourself. And kind of like the scientist who didn't just take Aristotle at his word, but actually investigated the scientific phenomenon, we can see Martin Luther moving forward in trying to in this push for people themselves to take up what was their own source, as opposed to the book of nature, as it's been described sometimes, the book of God and the Christ, and do your own reading and your own deep reflective thinking, and in that introspection, discover for yourself what God truly wants of us. This obviously is massively controversial. So not only is in science the authority of Aristotle being questioned and people sort of rebelling against that revelation, here too the Catholic priests and those who have dominated for so long are recognizing the seeds here for a revolution in religiosity and theology that take place. What we'll eventually get is a entirely new branch of Christianity called Protestantism, where people are expected themselves. You still have, of course, priests and such who help us interpret and deliver us sermons and beckon us to gather together as communities and such. But ultimately, it is on the individual to start to interpret for themselves what their relationship with God and Christ and so forth is. It's a monumental feat, again, in this way. And what really helps this new movement to move along is going to be thanks to this incredible invention. I mean, I should really say a number of inventions, but this is the one I'm particularly going to highlight: the printing press. Now we can make books. I mean, we could make books. Before, what's the difference? The difference is that we can make a massive number of copies of that book, and we can do it with minimal error. If you think about it, this is as revolutionary to this time as the computer was at its conception to our time. The printing press means that you don't have monks who are spending their extra free time where they can, copying over books, often in the wee hours of the evening or the morning, often making errors in the transcription, and only churning out one book maybe a year, maybe every couple of years. Even just copying from page to page takes forever. So to get a hold of a really good book, of a classic, of something of weight and value in the sciences or elsewhere was rare. And you either had to have a lot of money or the means to access those libraries. It was troublesome. You had to go great distances. It was really troublesome. Printing press changes everything. The printing press makes it possible for us to print thousands upon thousands of copies of the Bible. And now suddenly everybody has access to the Bible. Martin Luther would not have been, his idea of the individual coming up to his own terms with the religion he practices would have hardly been possible if it weren't for the ability for everyone to get a copy of the book or find easily enough a copy of the Bible, of the books that are available now at this time. So the sciences are being revolutionized, religion is being revolutionized, and the printing press is making it possible. Again, no less revolutionary in a way than the computer and later the internet. To date, for the record, oddly enough, the Bible, as I understand it, is still the book of most printed copies in the world. And with the spread of imperialism and Christianity and such, that makes perfect sense. Why? All right, as we're coming closer to the end of this lecture, I want to touch on also an interesting opposition that Gaarder brings up and that really is there, but I think is also somewhat misrepresented. So it's this between idealism and materialism. Let's look real quick at how the Routledge Encyclopedia would define these two terms. Idealism, the view that mind is the most basic reality and that the physical world exists only as an appearance to our expression of mind. And materialism, a set of related theories which hold that all entities and processes are composed of, or are reducible to, matter, material forces, or physical processes. Now there is a lot to be said for what Gaarder has done here in trying to present these two opposing forces. It makes it out to seem, though, that one, that they are indeed in perfect opposition. And it also, for that reason, too, it would be easy for us to think, well, a thinker was either an idealist or a materialist. And others have sometimes made it seem that way. That book that I recommended earlier, for instance, The Cave in the Light, in that book, Herman himself often poses Platonic thinking as primarily and more or less as really just idealism. Whether he means to or not, it was definitely primarily idealist in this sense, but and Aristotelianism as materialist. And while these are fair enough for an introductory philosophy course, fair enough simplifications to work with and go far with, it would also do an injustice to these thinkers to make them seem as if they fall only into one of either camp. Let's take one character in particular. I want to talk about Kepler for a moment, whom Gaarder, if he mentions him at all, I believe he does, but doesn't go into much depth around. Kepler was an incredible thinker, and Kepler took the Copernican system and recognized so many of its flaws. On the one hand, he entertains a more idealist notion of the solar system, and on the other hand, he comes up with the best materialist explanations for what's happening regarding the planets and heavenly bodies. The Copernican system, if you recall, still mostly conceptualized the orbits of planets as being contained within these spheres. But if you look at Kepler and his work, you realize that he's the first among few that I know, the only one person I know, who really first conceptualizes these orbits as curvilinear paths as opposed to shells. It's a phenomenon that's worth getting right, because then we can actually imagine if you have curvilinear paths instead of spheres, then we can actually imagine a plane through a plane by which all the orbits are coplanar, meaning here that that plane might pass through the orbits of all the planets and the planets themselves perfectly or imperfectly, and we have a way of conceptualizing a solar system in this almost sort of two-dimensional way. It's also been really helpful in trying to think of the orbit of now considered non-planets like Pluto, which doesn't fall on it isn't coplanar, doesn't fall on this conception of the solar system as a plane. He also, furthermore, correctly manages to he sees these orbits not as circular, but as elliptical, sort of like Hypatia way back in the day, it would seem, or at least the ideas that Hypatia would have been entertaining at her time. So the idea of orbits as elliptical and not elliptoids, but curvilinear and elliptical, means that you're not dealing with one circular focus, but you're dealing with two foci around which an ellipsis is formed. And so what are those foci? The sun is one of them. And we can kind of imaginarily posit a second one as simply part of the manner in which these orbits are manifest. And if you have the sun at one, that means if the sun is a foci on this ellipsis, that the planet isn't always as close as it is at other times to the sun. And you start explaining these other phenomena really well that are going on. Heavenly bodies are starting to make a lot of sense now. His proportional law, where not just they're elliptical, but you can actually calculate their periods, where if you took the distance of a planet from the sun and cubed it, that would be proportional to squaring the time it takes for it to go around, the period as it's called, the time for it to go around the sun. I mean, mathematics is being revolutionized in order to explain these physical phenomena, and Newton is one of the first major people to not just observe but appreciate these workings of those like Kepler. All right, so there's the materialist part of Kepler. There's an idealist part too. He was very, very fond of the Platonic forms. The Platonic solids specifically were an interesting idea to him, where you can see them here on screen. So you have, starting from the top, you have the tetrahedron, you have the cube, otherwise known as the hexahedron, then the octahedron, the dodecahedron, and the icosahedron, each of which has a different number of faces, of points, of vertices. They're mathematically insanely beautiful. And we thought up to a certain point in history that there were only 5 of them, but it turns out if you bend or change a few rules about how they're formed, you can come up with more than these. And what are they exactly? They're these solids that are made of what are called, you could call them perfect shapes, or often we call them just regular shapes. I like the idea of perfect shapes. But a regular shape is one where they're equilateral, all the sides are the same length, and so if you were to take these shapes and try all these different combinations, you'd find that only a few shapes combined in a few ways create these polyhedra, that is, these solids that are also perfectly self-similar in how they're spaced, where there's no cracks in between them or anything. These are the solids. And Plato, if not invented them, discovered them in some form and promoted them pretty heavily, and they're known, therefore, as the Platonic solids. And Kepler strongly believed that God, in his own theological mindset, that God created the universe in such a way that it would have perfect harmony, perfect formation. Why wouldn't he use these perfect forms? Why wouldn't he use the solids as a way of perhaps distancing the planets at certain intervals? Why else are there distances of certain intervals between the planets in our system, in our solar system? You can see a model here of that, where he said if you were to take, of course he's promoting orbits over spheres, but if you were, just for the sake of determining distance of the planets to the sun, to take these spheres and you were to inscribe them and circumscribe them, so put on the inside, touching the sides of the polyhedra in one case, and then circumscribe where it covers and touches all the points of the polyhedra, then you were to nest those polyhedra in one another in such a way that it turns out these solids can actually be arranged in such a way that the octahedron fits perfectly within the hexahedron or cube, such that the points touch the center of every side, and so forth. If you've never played around with this idea, go look it up. Tons of YouTube videos on this. I'll even later perhaps give you a link to a GeoGebra presentation that'll show some of these and their relationship to each other. And so then if you were to use that as a way of figuring out the intervals of distance given the spheres as both, again, inscribed and circumscribing those polyhedra nested in that particular formation, then you would seem to get pretty close to the actual intervals of the distance of the planets to the sun. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. But we have absolutely zero reason to think that this is the real reason for those intervals. And of course, there are mistakes in there too. But again, what I want to emphasize here is that Kepler and those who came before him, and even those who are around today, still often have a materialist side and an idealist side. If you don't believe me around that, again, investigate string theory, investigate current models of science that are supposed to fundamentally explain material, and you will find idealist elements around how things should be. Mathematics, if ever you feel like you're reading something that everything could be reducible to the mathematics involved, you are engaged, whether you believe it or not, in some aspect of idealism. But if we were to take these at their extremes, of course, and say that idealism, an idealist philosophy, is one that says, no, not just that there are idealist aspects to the phenomenon, but that phenomenon themselves are purely the stuff of idea, which we will see a lot more soon in this book. It plays an important role in this book, and that materialism is the opposite in the sense that even ideas and such can be reduced to the matter and things that give birth to those ideas. We still see that today, where we still think of ideas or the mind as being really just some sort of epiphenomenon to neurons and circuits in the brain, and that's all physical matter. So one or the other of these extreme versions of the world, which is right? This is a sort of false dichotomy that is being presented here. And by a false dichotomy, as a fallacy, this is another very important fallacy here, that we're saying there's two and only two options, and you have to choose between them. There's no third option. As it were, you can see that there are cases where both are at play in the same thinker, such as Kepler, and other times where we can find instances where neither are really at play, that there are third options. As myself, a speculative realist, I actually believe that neither of these are quite adequate in order to describe the reality that we live in. And while we can have idealist elements and materialist elements, that is, we have a physical world and we have a mental world and minds and so forth, that there's also the part of the world that is neither one of those. And since this is not a course on Kelsey's philosophy, but Gaarder's philosophy, I won't go into the weeds or details of that. But keep in mind that it really is a false dichotomy as far as it would seem to say there's only these two options. To wrap things up, we also want to be aware of how things are changing at this point in time. The Baroque period is often underrated in its value, perhaps, but is extremely important, obviously, to Gaarder, and I think so as well. My favorite musicians, composers, are actually Baroque, such as Bach and others. But here we see this painting, and if you remember, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment tend to invoke imagery of light, the incredibleness of virtues and gods and beauty and so forth. And what we start to notice here as we're moving into Baroque times, as the Renaissance is continuing to move forward, and we get conceptions of reality or even theology here in a very different color and hue. The very hues and colors here in this painting by Peter Paul Rubens are dark. It's called The Raising of the Cross. So we know that this is Jesus being crucified, being put on the cross, if you couldn't tell. And there's actually a lot more to this painting that I've left out in trying to hone in on this. So go check out the original at some point. It's actually, this is one part of what's called a triptych, or a 3-part painting. There's stuff going on to the left, stuff going on to the right. But the main things worth denoting here, or pointing out here, I should say, the main things worth pointing out here are the kind of horror that we can see. I mean, there's something very, not just dark in the color, but dark in the themes here. Jesus is pale and appears, actually, even in this somewhat, beautiful depiction of him in a sense, looks weak and pale in comparison to the men who are attempting to lift him up, as if there's just this absolute incredible weight. He can't possibly be that heavy. So what is so heavy? Why is it requiring all these huge muscular men to put this cross up? It's the weight of what he represents. And we see up here too, hints of an earlier time. These are quotes and such from parts of, I believe, the Bible, but also other beliefs where the gods are punishing. And here we see Jesus willingly giving himself up and looking to the heavens for his own saving by his Father God and so forth. And so there's this sort of dichotomy going on here between, the God that would punish versus the God that would hopefully save and show compassion for his so-called son, his so-called only son in Christian speak. So this darkness, this dichotomy making, this period of Baroque aesthetics and art is really just, again, a parallel movement to what is happening in philosophy, the dichotomies that are going to continue, not just idealist and materialist, but others. They're going to continue to formulate. We'll start to see more evidence of what's called the mind-body problem and so forth. That will be continued next time as we get into one of the first major incredible thinkers that have shaped our times, Descartes.